On November 16th, 1971, just before 5:30 p.m., 10-year-old Carmen Colon was running down the shoulder of New York's Interstate 490. Because it was rush hour, dozens, if not hundreds of people saw her, and she was hard to miss. Carmen was only partially clothed, running away from a car that was chasing her in reverse down the shoulder of the highway. She waved her arms frantically, trying to get one of the many cars she saw to stop. According to eyewitnesses, when the person chasing her in the vehicle caught up to her, Carmen was seen being meekly guided back to it. 2 days later, Carmen's body was found less than 12 miles from where she'd been seen desperately asking for help. Everything that happened to Carmen after that afternoon was a direct result of all the eyewitnesses choosing not to help her, even when she was clearly in need. But why would a crowd of people fail to help a child who was in such obvious distress? In this video, we'll be discussing the psychology behind the bystander effect. The bystander effect first gained attention in the 1960s after the murder of Kitty Genovese. In the decades since then, it's become widely accepted that the circumstances around Kitty Genovese's murder were not actually an example of the bystander effect. Nonetheless, her death and the circumstances around it brought into cultural awareness the idea that you could be in dire need of help and surrounded by people who will just choose not to help you. The original psychologists who studied this phenomenon, Latane and Darley, created a framework that takes us through the decision-making of bystanders. Specifically, they identified 5 steps that encompass the perceptual and cognitive processes that bystanders go through that determine whether or not they will intervene. These steps are notice, interpret, determine responsibility, identify form of assistance, and act. We're going to go through each of these steps to demonstrate how individual and environmental factors can affect our decision-making at each point. First and foremost, before a bystander can intervene, they have to notice something is happening in their vicinity. What people notice is determined by how they're deploying their attention in the moment. If a person is deeply focused on something, like say a podcast, and has earbuds in, they're much less likely to hear someone shouting, which is pretty intuitive. However, it's much more egregious than that. Research has shown that when participants are given a task that requires their undivided attention, many people will fail to take notice of something that's completely bizarre and out of context, even when it's right in front of them. In the very famous study by Simons and Chabris, researchers showed participants a video and asked them to keep track of how many times a ball was passed between people who are wearing white t-shirts. About 50% of participants were so busy counting the ball passes that they failed to see a person in a gorilla costume walk through the middle of the scene. The research on attention broadly demonstrates that whether or not someone notices something has to do with how available their attentional resources are in the moment. In other words, the first step of simply taking notice that something is happening is less likely to be affected by cognition because it's largely a perceptual task. Once we've taken notice that there's something happening around us, we move on to the next step in the process, which is to interpret what we're witnessing and decide if it's an actual emergency or not. A good example of this comes from the 1975 film Jaws.
Marty, I know you got a lot of problems downtown, but I've got a couple of problems with the house I wish you could take care of.
One, I've got some cats parking in front of the house. I can't get down to the office, and that garbage truck next to the office has got to be moved.
So what I need is a red zone. It's a simple thing.
In that clip, Chief Brody, who was already monitoring the shoreline, heard the scream, he stood up, he interpreted more information, determined it wasn't a real emergency, and settled back down into his seat. It can also happen that we go the other direction and erroneously identify an emergency where there isn't evidence of one at all. For example, take this story from 2020 about an American Airlines passenger who falsely accused a Black social worker of kidnapping when actually the social worker had a court order showing that the child was legally in her care. How our brains interpret the signals around us as indicators of an emergency or not has a lot to do with our individual backgrounds, training, and beliefs. So it's vital that we focus on interpreting what is happening directly in front of us, and that we don't incorporate other information based on stories we've been told or misinformation we believe, but that there's no evidence of in front of us. This brings us to the third step in Latane and Darley's decision-making framework, which is determining responsibility to act. Imagine you're walking down a suburban street early in the morning, like at 5 a.m. Everything is still and quiet, and you see just one other person walking down the other side of the road. Suddenly, that person collapses. What would you do? Most people in that situation would take action because there's no question about who's responsible. If you don't act, the person won't receive the help they need. But now imagine the same scenario, but instead it's 5 p.m. There's cars on the road and more pedestrians. If you saw the same person collapse across the street from you, would you instinctually respond in the same way? Research suggests probably not, because of something called diffusion of responsibility. Research has shown that diffusion of responsibility increases as the number of bystanders goes up. But the biggest drop in the likelihood of a bystander intervening happens when you go from one individual bystander to a small group of just 3 to 4 bystanders, indicating that the mere presence of just a few other people is enough to create diffusion of responsibility in bystanders. In addition to diffusion of responsibility, a person can feel less responsibility to help someone if they themselves are caught up in their own perceived emergency. For example, take the 1973 study by Darley and Batson, known as the Good Samaritan study. In this study, theology students were all told that they were going to deliver a talk on the Good Samaritan parable. Half of the students were told that they didn't have to rush and that they had plenty of time to get there to deliver the talk. The other half of the students were told that they were short on time and needed to rush to the talk. On the way to the talk, the student participants encountered a confederate, which in this context means someone who's working with the researchers unbeknownst to the participants. The confederate, who appeared to be a person in distress, asked the study participants for help. The theology students who were told that they were short on time and in a rush to get to the talk were much less likely to help the person than the ones told that they had plenty of time. In that case, the quote-unquote emergency was getting to a talk to teach others about helping people. And that was enough to cause them to act in a way that is directly at odds with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now you might be thinking, well, if the students were eager to find a job or make professional connections, it may be an emergency to them that they show up on time because it could potentially mean losing out on a job opportunity or a potentially meaningful professional connection. The researchers thought of this too. So they added another condition where students were told that they were going to meet people to talk about job opportunities. They told half of those students that they had plenty of time to get there, and the other half were told that they were running late and needed to rush. Again, the results showed that the students who were rushing were less likely to help. Another factor that determines a bystander's sense of responsibility to help has to do with the identity of the person in need. In 2002, a study showed that people's racial biases predicted whether or not they intervened as a bystander. In this study, the researchers used a similar paradigm as in the Good Samaritan study, where they had a Confederate pretend to be a person in need of help. In this study, though, the researchers manipulated the race of the Confederate. The researchers measured participants' explicit and implicit racial biases. Explicit racial biases are probably exactly what you're thinking of: saying racist things openly, sharing and propagating misinformation about people from other races. In contrast, Implicit racial biases are often automatic and baked into our perception and cognition, such that we are not always consciously aware that we even have them. This distinction explains why you can have people who claim that they're not racist, but then behave in very racist ways. The results of this study showed that the extent of implicit racial biases in participants determined whether or not they offered help to the Confederate. Moreover, the magnitude of their implicit bias against specific racial groups was reflected in their reaction times, meaning the more implicit racial bias a participant had against a specific group, the less likely they were to help a Confederate from that group, and if they did help, they helped more slowly and with less urgency. These studies, and others like them, demonstrate that we foster inherent beliefs, often unknowingly, about who does and doesn't deserve our help. When we consider the fact that Carmen Colon was Puerto Rican, and in 1971 the population of Rochester, New York was 80% white, it becomes tragically evident why many people probably chose not to help her. Although these are not all the factors that determine a bystander's perceived sense of responsibility, they are factors that we as individuals have control over. We can work to become more mindful and present in the moment to stop our own perceived emergencies from preventing us from helping others. We can work to overcome our implicit racial biases to realize that all people deserve our help regardless of their race. This is a step in the decision-making process where we can intervene on our own curious wiring and restructure it to give us a more objective and equitable sense of responsibility as bystanders. Once a bystander has determined that they have a responsibility to act, they next have to identify how they're going to intervene, either directly or indirectly. In the example we used for diffusion of responsibility, it's that split-second choice of whether you're going to run across the street to check on the person who collapsed or call 911 first. Importantly, a person might not always know what the right thing to do first is. Their individual background and experience will determine this. For example, a medical doctor might be more likely to run to the person to administer CPR before calling 911, whereas a person with no medical training might opt to call 911 first to get trained professionals on the scene as quickly as possible. Once a bystander has identified a plan of action, the last step in the decision-making process is choosing whether or not to take action. One of the biggest reasons people hold back from intervening as bystanders is fear of embarrassment. Everyone has a different threshold for embarrassment. Someone who is shy or reserved may need to see a more obvious or severe emergency before stepping in because the social risk of drawing attention to themselves feels too great. In addition to baseline differences in our willingness to risk embarrassment, another common fear is misjudging the situation. Bystanders worry they'll act and look foolish if it turns out they overreacted. But as Latanya and Darley demonstrated, people usually recognize emergencies fairly quickly. So when someone has gone through all the previous steps of the decision-making process and still doesn't act, it's often not because they're unsure, it's because the fear of social judgment is so strong that they lean on ambiguity or plausible deniability to excuse their inaction. At nearly every stage of Latanya and Darley's bystander decision-making framework, our personal biases can shape how we interpret a situation and whether we choose to act. The good news is that once we become aware of these biases, we can start to recognize when they're influencing our judgment and decision-making. The person who ended Carmen Colon's life was never caught, despite the fact that so many people saw him and his vehicle firsthand. If just one person had acted on that November afternoon, there is good reason to believe that Carmen might still be alive today. If you'd like to join me in honoring her memory, and with the hope of preventing similar tragedies, please consider making a donation to BAMFI, which raises awareness and provides support on missing person cases just like Carmen's. Humans are an inherently social species, and this comes with strengths and weaknesses. In the video today, we discussed the bystander effect, which at its core is a social weakness that arises from our desire to avoid embarrassment. However, there are times when we have to go against our instincts and risk rejection. It's much easier to live with feeling foolish for a few minutes or even a few days than to live with the knowledge that you could have helped someone and chose not to, simply out of fear of judgment. While it's true that our curious wiring is designed to keep us safe, it's our willingness to go against it when it matters that really makes us human.